Hi! This video we're going to take a look at PoE, or rather Power over Ethernet. And we're going to do that in regards to these IP cameras I showed you a few videos back. If you haven't seen that video, it's an interesting one about these 8 megapixel 4K IP cameras, so make sure to check the description and watch that one also. So, what we're going to discuss today is how you can power one of these cameras using just the network connection for data and power instead of having to run two cables for power and data separately. Let's take a look at that. So, PoE, or as I said, Power over Ethernet. Now, PoE can be a bit of a complex subject, but I'll try and break it down what you need to watch out for. This video will primarily highlight what you need for a 100 Mbit IP camera. 99% of the IP cameras out there are 100 Mbit because it doesn't really benefit from anything like a gigabit or something like that. So keep that in mind. Taking my camera for example again, if you buy an IP camera, often you can select to have them with PoE, or as I said, Power over Ethernet. So normally you can take an adapter like this. You can plug it into the power socket of the camera and the camera will turn on. Then you can take your Ethernet cable and provide it with a data connection so you can actually watch the images. Of course, that means you have to route two cables to the camera instead of one. Well, using PoE, we just need the Ethernet wire, which will transport our data and power to the camera. A big advantage of using Ethernet cable is that the connectors on these cables you can easily crimp on yourself. So if you're running these cables through a wall or conduit, you can just pull the wire through and then add the connector when you're done. So you only have to drill small holes, etc. Using normal PoE, and we'll dive deeper into what PoE is later on in the video, these cables can be about 100 meters or 330 feet. So that's quite a long distance. Okay, things you need to know. PoE comes in 3 different varieties, but we're discussing 2. Active and passive PoE. The difference is quite simple. Active PoE actively asks the device you're connecting if it wants power or not. Passive PoE just sets current on the pins, and if the device you're connecting to isn't suitable for that, well, that's probably why it's also dubbed unsolicited PoE. That might end bad. So, from the two, active PoE is the safest form to use. To make things even more complex, next to having active and passive PoE, there is also Mode A and Mode B. Mode A means that it uses the same pins as your data signal travels over to send the current. Mode B means that it uses the spare pins, because a 100 Mbit connection only uses 4 pins, on the 8-pin connector to transfer the power over the cable. Mode A is often also referred to as end-span, and Mode B is often referred to as mid-span. So, the last information you need to know before we move on to sample devices is active PoE is always 48 volt. Passive PoE on the other end can be 48 volt or something like 24 volt. Equipment from Mikrotik or Ubiquiti often uses passive PoE at 24 volts. Active PoE at 48 volts is often also referred to as 802.3 AF or 802.3 AT. Now I get all of this can get quite confusing. So let's get back to our IP cameras. IP cameras almost always use active PoE at 48 volts, but can also take passive PoE at 48 volts. And most cameras should also accept Mode A or Mode B. So that makes it a lot easier. Before we can determine what equipment we can use to feed PoE, we first need to determine what our requirements are. And I'm going to use one of my favorite 8 megapixel cameras, as I showed in the video before. You can check that out in the description. As an example, this camera can use a maximum of 8 watts of power. Generally, it'll use about 3 or 4 watts, but with infrared and the zoom motor running, etc., a maximum power draw of 8 watts. Okay, fine. Then, looking at video speeds, it can also use a maximum of 8 megabits of data throughput. So, let's take those values and see what we can use. The most common device you'll use to power your PoE devices or IP cameras is a PoE switch. And let me try and get these. These come in lots of different varieties, from a 5-port or a 8-port up to 48 ports and even bigger if you want. Switches are often available in 100 megabit varieties or gigabit varieties. As mentioned, for our cameras, you only need 100 Mbit, but make sure you don't go above 8 ports, because we need 8 megabits per camera as a maximum, and if you only have a 100 Mbit uplink port, you're going to saturate it. So, if you get a 100 Mbit switch, don't put more than 8 cameras on it. And if you also want to power some access points, you probably want to get a gigabit model, but a gigabit PoE switch will work just fine with 100 megabit IP cameras. For home situations, a 5 or 8 port switch is mostly sufficient. Another thing to take notice of is power draw. If you're going to put 8 cameras on a switch, you're going to need 8 times 8 watts of power, so at least 64 or let's say 70 watts of power. Make sure the power adapter that comes with the switch or you're using can handle that. In theory, switches are always active PoE devices, but nowadays, especially the cheap models, they offer passive or unsolicited PoE. Now this isn't a problem per se, but we'll discuss those types of switches in our PoE injector part of this video. I've listed some examples like this 8-port switch or a 5 or 8-port Netgear variety in the description. And check out the description for all my links. Those are affiliate links to either Amazon or AliExpress. But they give me a little kickback and help out the channel to make these videos. In those links I'll also show an 8-port Mikrotik model, which I like, and a 24-port Mikrotik model, which also has 4 10 gigabit ports and, as I said, 24 PoE ports. It's a really nice switch and gets you a lot of power for a good price. So, if you're not going to have a lot of PoE devices, a PoE injector might be a better choice. Now, these come in 2 different varieties, either active or passive, and they come in single-port and multi-port varieties. So let's take a look at those. So to start off, let's look at this simple model. This is basically a 1-port PoE injector, and I call it a dumb PoE injector. Basically, you plug in your LAN to your switch, and then you plug in this cable to your PoE device. And this one uses 48 volts, passive, mode B. But works great for IP cameras. So if you only have 1 or 2 devices, you can get 1 or 2 of these, and that should work out just fine. Next to these dumb PoE injectors, or passive PoE injectors, you also have active PoE injectors. I don't have one at hand right now, but as I mentioned before, active PoE is safer to use than passive PoE, so in certain situations you should prefer active over passive. Getting back to passive injectors, this is a multi-port passive injector. So this one is a gigabit 6-port model, but you can have them in 6 ports or 12 ports, which I'll show you in a little bit. And they support anywhere from 18 to 57 volts, and you can use them for mode A or mode B, depending on which power plug you use. They work the same way as the little adapter. They have 6 LAN ports on this side, where you plug in the cable to your switch, and then they have 6 PoE ports on this side, where you plug in the cable that goes to your camera or other PoE device and then is provided with power. Next to this 6-port model, I use a 12-port rack mount model for my own home situation. Here you can see my rack and you can see the 12 cables coming from my switch and then the 12 cables coming out of the POE or Gigabit POE injector, which go to my 5 access points and my cameras in and around the house. So the primary reason I'm using a Gigabit POE injector in rack form and 12 ports, etc., is basically because it's cheaper and it also doesn't have the bandwidth constraints a Gigabit switch with a 1 Gigabit uplink would have, because I'm using 5 access points. Now, I know this is a bit overkill, but if you're talking 12 access points, a Gigabit connection could quickly become the limiting factor if you have a lot of clients. But if you use a passive injector like this, you basically don't have any bandwidth constraints except what's on your switch already. Going one step further, and I hinted at this just a little bit ago, if you also need the switch but don't want to spend the money for an active POE switch, because these will cost you anywhere from 60 to 80 to 100 bucks, you can go for a passive POE switch instead of just an injector. And that's where these models come in. So the top one is a 100 Mbit model, which can do mode A or mode B. And the bottom one is a gigabit model. So these are passive injectors and can do mode A or mode B. The gigabit model actually has a switch per port on the back, and the 100 Mbit model, you either plug in mode A or mode B into your power supply. But these have a switch built in. So they're still passive injectors. They don't negotiate if they want power. But if you also need a switch, they can be a great choice because they can be had for about half the amount of the money for an active POE switch. So if you do this at home and you're the one managing the network and you know which cables are for which devices, and I use these orange cables for my POE devices, you won't make the mistake of plugging in a device which doesn't support it. And well, that basically covers POE or Power over Ethernet for IP cameras. I know it can get a bit daunting, but luckily most POE circuits in IP cameras are very forgiving. So you can use active or passive and mode A or mode B. And as I mentioned, you can go the expensive route by using an actual switch, an intelligent switch, or an intelligent injector, or most often in home situations where you have good control over what cable does what, you can use passive switches or injectors. Personally, I'm also using a 12-port gigabit injector for my access points and cameras, and the main reason was because it was a lot cheaper than an active switch. During events or other situations, I use active POE so that other devices don't get fried. If you still have questions about POE after this video, let me know down in the comments and we can discuss about that. If you want to have a more lengthy discussion though and like the channel, consider subscribing, maybe liking the video, and maybe joining our Discord server. There we can have a longer discussion and talk about all kinds of subjects relating IP cameras or anything else on the channel. So again, if you want to buy something I featured in this video, check out the links in the description. If you do and use my link, that would be greatly appreciated. And yeah, catch you in the next video. Bye bye.